it becomes more efficient. So there's something to be said for that. But you know, a state bank is actually something a little bit different. And actually, because of its leverage, and can actually, you know, promote economic development. It actually has it's a richer opportunity for doing more interesting things. I don't want to get into the specifics of these various programs. It might be worth dealing into a little bit with, you know, the Empire State Development, maybe in the discussion section about like what actually exists out there. But there are some programs that kind of do some things like participation lending and trying to help community banks, but they've been very problematic. And a lot of the state, you know, to be fair, a lot of the state economic development is basically in the form of like tax credits and tax incentives. And there's a big question about how effective those things actually are. I don't think there's any clear evidence that they're terribly effective, but that's generally how most state programs do it. And that's not just New York, to be fair. So one of the ways, and I think we're talking about also like how do we fund the state bank. Scott talked specifically about the pension fund and basically where the state pulled its money. And we've also looked about like where a state actually sits its money as well. So I want to hold off on personally talking about the retirement fund and the pensions and that. But also the state basically has its own checking account, and it's something called the short-term investment pool. And basically, on any given day, it's about $9 billion worth of dollars, $9 billion, and the state currently has an interest rate of return of 0.148%. And that's been basically what it's been having for a few years. I mean, 05, 06, the state was making 5 or 6% on this, but it's basically, you know, the state's checking account, more or less. So there's not a lot of money being done. The state invests this money and puts it basically in banks. And the banks do that, you know, as I think the slides from both Felice and Scott have shown, that the state, you know, the banks actually put this money wherever they think they're going to make the most profit. But, you know, the center, for instance, has looked at this as being a really good source of money for deposits for a state bank, for instance, because currently, you know, it's not actually making any rate of return on this at all. And it's a pretty big pot of money. And there's a lot of technicalities, so it's worth, I'm not going to bore you with those details right now. But it's one of those ideas of sources of money that it's worth talking about for investments. Yes, that was actually it for that. I kept the slide short for that. So that's one of the things. Also, you know, there's questions about where actually we want to put some of these things. But so the deposits are one side, and also the actual funding for state bank is sort of the other question. Like, banks need capital to start up. So the STIP money, which is the bank's checking account, isn't really good startup money. It needs money that can sit there. So, you know, maybe there's pots of money that are just sitting there. The center has looked possibly at bonding, you know, because these agencies like the ESD, state authorities can bond. There's a lot of problems with bonding. Obviously, you take on more debt. So there have to be really serious questions about how you're raising a fair amount of money that a bank can actually use to kind of get startup fees. So we have to think about that. We have to think about the operating funds, where else to get from. If we actually open up to private sources, foundations, or municipalities, we have to think about, if we're talking about partnership lending, basically who a bank actually partners with. Would a state bank partner with Chase? I mean, chances are Chase might be one of the less likely banks that would be interested in this, and would probably be opposed to something like this. But when you talk about, you know, moderate-sized banks and smaller banks, there's an open question about what's actually what we want to do with these things. We have to get a sense of like how big we want a bank to be. It's a completely open question about if we move the entire portfolio of the Common Retirement Fund, that's, I think it's 150 billion at the moment or something like that. Like, that would be a really big bank. And probably would not be very politically realistic. But like, so we have to figure out a question like, you know, if we're actually going to propose something at some point, there's going to be questions about how big we want it to be. You want it to be big enough to actually get people interested, because if it's a small bank that doesn't do anything more really than a lot of these economic development agencies, then no one's really going to get excited. But if you get too big, you're going to scare people. So there was a question about that as well. We have to think about where we actually house the bank. There's a lot of state legislative issues that get worked in, like if a bank can lend, if a state can lend, if state government can lend, and how do you actually do that? So there's questions about possibly, you know, we could possibly think about redoing the economic Empire State Development in a way that could actually do that. Finally, there's two other things. So there's basically questions of how it would operate, which we don't get in those nuts and bolts, but we really have to think about oversight too. And I think this is something that, it's sort of this political question that's really interesting and probably really important, because we have to figure out, as this goes forward, ideally in a legislative process, like what's actually going to be an effective way to create a good structure for a state bank that doesn't basically run into problems with corruption and poor management and everything like this. And like a lot of the times, the legislation does get changed a little bit in Albany from the initial good beginnings. So this is something that as we kind of think about the state bank, we have to think about how exactly to do it, who's in charge, what kind of oversight there is. One of the interesting things about North Dakota is the oversight mechanisms for the Bank of North Dakota aren't actually terribly strong. It's just everyone's kind of been on the level for the last 80, 90 years or so, and there's actually good, there's good clarity. They have very good books, and they put out a lot of good, disclosure, but the actual decisions can be made more or less by the government and, the governor and a couple of his representatives and a couple of his appointees. So when we're actually creating a big idea for New York, we have to think about how we want to actually do that in a way that works and is clear and is making something that's actually rigorously defined and strong. So we could get into a lot more of those specifics, I think, maybe in the discussion, because I think that's interesting, but I didn't want to get into too much of the nuts and bolts there. So that's pretty much mostly what I have at this point. I want to thank you all for paying attention and listening to this, and hopefully we go into questions then. And yes, I've been talking too fast.
Thank you, Mark. That was wonderful. I'm going to ask all three if you would just come up here. We don't really have a table, but we're going to have a panel discussion here.
Could this be started on sort of a pilot basis, and thinking specifically that there are some funds out there that are pretty regular, and the towns bond and towns maintain reserves. And just between that, in the entire state of New York, it's probably enough to make kind of like a dedicated state bank just to cover that business and kind of work the kinks out of how you would operate it. So it's an easier startup.
Yeah, I think that maybe is this on? Yes. Oh, it is. Okay. I guess from being lower, it's hard to tell. There is an element with it. I mean, I think one of the issues with trying to figure a lot of this out is also the specifics of how to work out how towns can invest, because there's limits on exactly where a town can invest its money and spread it around as well. So there's a lot of legislative specifics that have to be kind of worked on with that. And I think a pilot project thing would be something that would work, because you start off small, and the Bank of North Dakota started out small and basically didn't really do anything for 30 or 40 years, because basically in 1919 North Dakota was a really progressive state, and that ended about 1920. And so what happens is basically there wasn't a lot of it didn't do much for many years. But when so it was actually small, and then it was able to slowly kind of build up, both the reputation in the state as being a good actor and basically working with municipalities and the state to actually do things in a sound and safe manner. And I think that was one thing that actually did help. So I think the idea of sort of a pilot project would be, there's always legislative problems, like in order to even get a pilot project on the ground, there's probably a lot of levers that have to be pulled. But the idea of having something, I think starting it smaller and kind of letting it go from there and letting it develop is probably a really smart way to approach it.
There's a question over here.
Yeah. Anyone else want to respond to that?
I think you covered.
My question
Yes.
is to you, ma'am. You're an assemblywoman.
Yes.
What's your sense of how many of your comrades in the assembly would be warm to the idea at this point?
Well, I right now I don't.
It's on.
Is it really on?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Right now we don't really have a Senate sponsor at this point. So we need to get a Senate sponsor. So maybe some of you could be helpful with that. We put the bill in, I think the first time was 3 years ago. Remember, Albany doesn't move real fast on a lot of things. And we've changed our idea over time, so we put it in as a study bill, the feasibility. Catherine McLaughlin on my staff has had a lot of discussions with people in the committee that deals with banks, and there's some interest, I would say. I think there'll be a lot of challenges with this, and I was thinking about the other states that have proposals before them. I think they're about 13, 20, whatever, and I was going to ask, I know Governor Brown vetoed one in California to just have a study. So that's not helpful. I can't figure out why we haven't had any change since, I mean, it's been a long time since North Dakota. So I think it's going to take a while, but that's why this meeting is good, because I think, you know, at least in Westchester, I tend to think this is the first, you're here on a first, like a first dialogue. Now, there may have been, I know in the city, you had some meetings and so on, but out here we haven't. So we really need to spread the information around the state that we really need to look at it. In response to yours, I think us having a feasibility study, we could get our bill passed. It's not saying we do it. It's just saying we put together a group of people that have the background, whether they're in the banking field, tax and finance, you know, having representatives from the governor and the Senate and the Assembly all together to try to see whether we would like to go in this direction. Now, the good news that I heard tonight was that Governor Cuomo, there may be an inkling of interest in this. So he's got a lot of things on his plate right now. We just finished our third on-time budget, but and we have a lot of other things. So it, you know, won't rise to the real level by the end of June when we're done. But if we can try to move this along, you know, and it will take your help if you're interested in doing that, and a lot of different organizations to do the same. I can't imagine why we don't want to look at it. It seems like there can be tremendous advantages to the people of New York State, but I can't figure out why other states haven't done it either. So, but maybe we can be a first. We're first on a number of things lately. Well, we'd be a second, but, you know, so we just have to really work at it. Things in the legislative body percolate. You kind of hear about them, you read about them, you may see a press release on it, you may see an article when your white paper comes out. That's another, you know, entrance into some more information. And whether it becomes, you know, a small public bank in the beginning, I think we have to work on the whole issue. I was talking with somebody earlier about campaign finance reform. Well, who's opposed to this? Let's think about who would be. You always have to think when you put a bill in, who's going to be opposed.
Exactly.
And so are those people opposed contributing dollars anywhere? I think we need public financing of campaigns myself so that we don't have that enter our problem of trying to get something done. So, but I think we've been through a lot of stress in our state. We've had to cut back on a lot of different programs for people. We're still doing it today, and so maybe people will have more of an interest in trying to protect their dollars, their tax dollars, and invest them well, and, you know, have a better outcome for our state. So I just think this is what happens. I can't, no crystal ball, but we'll keep working on it, and I think everybody here will do the same.
Okay.
Yes.
I just add a little bit to that. On our Public Banking Institute site, we have a map, which you all have in the flyer if you got it for this presentation, that shows the status of different states in color. So we have 10 states that have a study bill, including New York. We have another 8 states that are maybe the next step beyond that. In other words, they're debating whether to actually set up a bank and how they would you know, do that. And if they pass the bill, that means an actual bank would get set up. And then we have Oklahoma, which is an interesting cross. It's a cross section, literally a cross hatch on the map, because they have 2 Indian nation banks, public banks. So they're actually public banks. They take the Indian tribal money and put it into tribal purposes, and they had little stumbles in the beginning, but now they're doing pretty well. So let's see, Vermont has a bill which just got out of committee, and it's going into the Maine legislature. Maine is looking at it pretty seriously. Massachusetts almost infamously defeated a bill, but it's been reintroduced. You know, a Fed study came out, the Federal Reserve put out a study, and they kind of said, well, why do we need this? We have all our big banks, and it doesn't do anything special. But remember who they work for and work with. So that's all I have to say on that.
What is the site?
Oh, Public Banking Institute?
That's what you need.
.org.
Yeah, .org.
Thank you. Thank you for the work all of you are doing on this. I think it's really important, potentially really important. You've talked a little about who are the potential supporters of it. And I'm wondering, I have two questions, whether any of those potential supporters have been recruited or reached out to, where the unions stand, for instance, where the public unions stand, if there's been communication with them. And my second question is about potential opposition. It seems fairly obvious, as you were just saying, that the private banking system, especially the big banks where the public money is deposited, would not want to lose those that one reliable source of deposits. So, and I had read in an article about this online that there is potential very dangerous opposition from the Obama administration's negotiations for the trade agreement. What is it called? The PPT? What is it? PPP. Could you say a little bit more about the opposition and really, so we get a sense of what we're up against and what the outreach to allies is?
I'm glad you brought that up because there are a couple of things that just came out with relation to not only TPP but a joint report by the FDIC and the Bank of England that came out in December. The TPP, first of all, specifically mentions Bank of England and the FDIC released a joint report. I'll get to that in a second. But the TPP specifically mentions state-owned enterprises. And this is an incredibly complicated bill, but basically what they want to do with this bill is to reduce all obstacles to businesses around the world, to anybody who signs this agreement, so that the lowest common denominator would apply, and that if there was some regulation in one country that wasn't in another, that country would have to pay a fine or get rid of the regulation so that the playing field would be so-called level, which means to say that the very lowest bottom, no environmental restrictions, no labor restrictions, nothing that would get in the way of the basest operation of a business in the worst possible country you can imagine. So that, and they mentioned the Bank of North Dakota because they were asked about this, and this is basically a socialist bank. Let's call it what it is. And they said, well, you know, this is a state-owned enterprise. We don't want to compete with a state-owned enterprise. That's not fair. So they would like to get rid of that. All right, that's on the table right now, and Obama is trying to fast-track it. They're calling it something else, but it's fast-tracking. Now, the other thing I mentioned, this just came out, and Ellen Brown, who's the chair and founder of the Public Banking Institute, wrote an article, and she had a link to it, so I read the report myself, and I know it's true. This FDIC and Bank of England came out with a joint report in December, and what they suggest is the next time a too-big-to-fail bank fails, is that the taxpayer will not be on the hook, the Fed won't be on the hook either, or the equivalent in England. Instead, they'll do what they're doing in Cyprus, and they'll take the deposits of the unsecured and possibly even the secured deposits, even the insured ones, and they'll give you equity in a failing bank instead. Now, as you can imagine in Cyprus, and you've seen it in Cyprus, this is not popular, but this is what they're proposing, and so this thing in Cyprus did not come out of thin air. This is a big deal, and I have it from a person in the credit union as well who got it from a different source, that this is being talked about in Congress, and he didn't even know about this report, so he had another source that said the same thing. So it's coming at us from two different places, from Congress and also from the FDIC and the Bank of England. So I think it behooves us to very quickly put more of these state banks out there before they can take them away from us. Anybody else?
Could I ask a question? I'm aware of some cross currents. A few years ago, I was in an event with Ellen Brown, and she was talking about the states that are doing this. I also know Steve Salinga, who is the head of the American Monetary Institute, who sees Ellen Brown as a real obstacle to getting what he sees, and what a lot of people like the Sinich see, like Conyers see, as essential, which is getting the creation of money capacity in the Treasury Department and the whole effort to get state banks. There's a cross-current in the alternative monetary discourse, and they're not working together. Can you bring us or
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I know both of these people. I've met Zarlinga 4 times because he came to the Henry George School and lectured. And I also met him separately as in a group.
He's speaking in the city next week.
Yeah, I know. He's also speaking in May. He's coming into Cooper Union,
Yeah.
which I'm going to attend. Yeah, he and Ellen Brown I've met. I also know Ellen. And they don't agree on some of the logistics. Now, the funny thing is, they're both greenbackers. What that means is that they both believe in debt-free money coming out of the Treasury. And this is the kind of thing that Lincoln did in 1862 to 63. He produced $450 million in direct issuance money without debt, direct from Treasury. Now, you can do that because we have this thing called the Constitution. And in Article 1, Section 8, it says that the Congress can coin money. If you want to learn more about that, I refer you to a paper, not only to Zarlinga, but to a paper by Robert Nadelson from Harvard. And he talks about what the coinage clause means. Anyway, I've read Zarlinga's book and I've read Ellen's work. And I don't want to go too deep into the weeds, but Ellen says that the problem with Zarlinga's plan is that it would require 100% reserves, and it would require the opposite of what happens now. The banks would have to borrow from the government instead of the government borrowing from the banks, and she believes that that would render them all insolvent overnight. Zarlinga says that won't happen, and that there would be this monetary authority, and they would produce all the money needed in the country. But, you know, there's a reason to be skeptical of that, too. But I do agree, I'm a greenbacker myself, I do agree that the government should produce at least the money that it needs, especially in these crisis times, which frankly is not that different than the Civil War when they needed money too. The greenbacks were 40% of the currency during the Civil War. They continued in 14 series through 1972. They were in circulation in 1996. They're actually our longest lasting currency. And you can buy them on eBay for twice the face value. I have two $5 US notes myself. But this is something that unfortunately is due, as I said.
Does this cross current still exist? Are people still
yeah, I mean, both of them have written papers critical of each other's plan. And unfortunately, unless you're a policy wonk or somebody who really cares about monetary reform, as you apparently do, you probably wouldn't even see that much daylight between them. If you go to Wikipedia and you look up monetary reform, you'll see them listed together as both greenbackers and people who want direct issuance of money.
Well, Ellen has changed her position after the last 3 years. She's become, she agrees with Zarlinga, she says in one part and disagrees in another part. But
yeah.
The energy seems to be divided, that's what I'm trying to say.
Well, Zarlinga also has a history with the Green Party in Illinois, and he claims that the state banking people knocked his proposal off of their platform because they, you know, there was a competition there, and so the one got jettisoned, they both basically got jettisoned, and so he blames her for that as well. But I agree with you. The progressive groups are dissipating their energy, and you know, this is why we don't get the things that need to get done. So we have to find a way to compromise and to agree on the basics. Now, we're here about state banking tonight, but that, as far as I'm concerned, you can do both. Now, Bill Still, who was a libertarian candidate for president, he had endorsed both of them. You know, he said you have to control the quantity of money from the governmental level, but he also not only endorsed state banking, he wanted Ellen Brown to be his vice presidential candidate. So he's finding a way to work with both, and I think other people should too.
Okay, way in the back.
If you actually have a run on the banks, in other words, the economic system is bound to collapse, especially the big banks, would a state bank have some way of defending itself, or would that just simply be overwhelmed also? That's the question.
Would a state bank have a way of preventing a run on its own bank?
Well, yes.
How would that bank?
Yes, it does, because it's not.
That are built on a house of cards.
A state bank is, it has, its receipts are coming from the taxes you pay,
Right.
from the fees that come to the state government. So it's not possible. The state is not going to say to the bank, give us back the money. then in order to have a run on a bank, the depositors have to show up at the door and demand their deposits back.
Depositors are just simply the state is the source.
So the state is basically the sole depositor. So it's not possible to have a run.
Oh, okay.
And that's part of the reason that I think that Mark used the term patient money, that the state has the ability to, even if it has not made even if it's made a problem loan, it has the ability, much more ability to work it through, because it's not under that kind of pressure. You know, it would be under some pressure because it would be a regulated entity like any other bank, but it's not, doesn't face the pressure of the reputational pressure that banks face when they have lots of problem loans, or the reputational pressure banks will face if people think what's going on in Cyprus is going to get exported to the U.S. That will have people lining up at the doors of banks mighty quick.
There's a question up here. Oh, in the back. Okay, and then up here.
Hi, I've been in real estate for 30 years, and I've seen a lot happen in the city and up here, and so I can see how trends happen. My main question is, are you looking at models of how the money would actually flow? For instance, if it's a local bank or a state bank or a community bank, would it make sense to concentrate on like the agricultural aspect of what happens, farmers markets, right, things like that, and then also go towards mortgages of the houses that are cropping up in that area and kind of have a nice, tight community feel for that, and keep that as one model, and then another model where anybody who's, you know, I guess Mark would know this because he's under 35 or whatever in Manhattan Bay, people don't hang around that much. They're very mobile now. So they're flying here, they're flying there, and this is going to happen more and more and more as being mobile. So then what kind of model do you use for that mobility of when you travel and so forth? Maybe it should be separate systems.
I think so. I'm not sure how to approach the mobility question. I think that's a good one, but I might either, I'll pause on that a little bit, maybe get to the other thing. I mean, I think one advantage with this kind of system is you have a bank that can actually focus on particular problem and areas and requirements for a state bank, and sort of requirements for an economy. New York is a very regional economy, I guess. You're pretty close. I'm exactly 35, actually. For what it's worth, I live in Brooklyn, so, but close enough. But there's an element where what's happening in New York City and, like, say, Westchester is different than what's happening in, like, say, Glens Falls, where the unemployment rate is one of the highest in the state. I mean, over 10%, for instance. I mean, it's not much lower here. But there's different issues and, industries, and the agricultural sector is going to be different in one part of the state versus another part of the state. So I think that's the one thing where, there's a level of, obviously, as Scott mentioned, like the Bank of North Dakota has one location. I think you did mention this in your presentation or earlier. I mean, there's just one presentation, but it worked throughout the state. And the advantage with the kind of system like you can have with the state bank is by working through the community, it's able to deal with the people and who know what's going on. And I think any sort of state bank model would have to figure out a way to actually have those kind of information channels open and clear. And that's really one of the most effective ways of making the state bank, an efficient and effective system, I think. Did that answer your question a little bit? No?
Well, let me just say that when I kind of got into this, Surin Kaushik is right here, we had a discussion, and it was about the subprime mortgage issue. And we were just talking about how can we help our homeowners in New York State. And, we had a lot of discussion. So I don't know what your question is, but that we were going to we were thinking about just honing in on one major problem at the moment. So I suppose you could do that. I don't know. Surin, you have a question?
Well, thank you. Surin Kaushik here. Many points, but let me start by saying that we recognize that the American banks, the Federal Reserve System, is owned by banks, private banks. So our system is 95% private. US government ownership of the Federal Reserve is at the most 5% in terms of the equity holding. So if the Chase, Citibank, etc., they own it, therefore all policies that flow from the Fed and Bank of England and so on, particularly the US side, we know that they really are technically, legally owned by banks. So they have to do what is needed of the banks. As far as the banks are concerned, as was mentioned, we have had a major liberalization since 1970s, particularly since 1980. And as the chart earlier showed, in the last 30 years, we had a tremendous increase in risk in the system every 5 years, and we've been going through all these cycles. So the size is increasing, and the risk is increasing, and that risk is not only increasing, but it is materializing. So therefore, losses are bigger and more often. That means the management, risk management by the Federal Reserve, by banks themselves, by other government agencies is total failure. It's out of control. And as I said earlier, much of it can be explained by Fed's behavior, that their owners are banks, so they really cannot call them on the carpet, so to speak. So we have to think of secondly, the timing is correct, because many people are forecasting today, right now, that we may be into deeper troubles in a year or 2 or 5 and so forth. If that happens next time around, we literally may have to go to greenbacks, and government may have to print and spread the money somehow from helicopters, so the economy can keep on going. Because if the banks fail, obviously the system will be in deep trouble. So the timing is correct, and the risk management requires that we have it. In terms of the question a moment ago about portfolio management, as to what the bank should do, obviously it could be defined in its constitution, its functions, and how much in real estate, how much agriculture, local economy, etc., all those portfolio things. As to the risk management, we could have higher capital requirements. Remember, only 40 years ago, American banks on their own used to have around 20% capital requirement. And the likes of Citibank by 1991 went down to as low as 2.5% capital. So the leveraging process, in other words, has gone out of control, and the risk management has totally failed within this bank and outside the bank, from the Fed and FDIC and so forth. So the system really is kind of a dysfunctional, and there is a great risk out there. Therefore, the necessity of dampening the impact. The other thing that has happened is the disconnect between banks and the real economy. So when we say the banks are 3 trillion, 4 trillion, money has been given as basically free by the Federal Reserve, and yet that money is not getting to individual small businesses and agriculture, what have you. That disconnect is the real failure. And that is where a state bank can be an institution that stabilizes the system, so that the standard deviation around the loan portfolio, loan increases, or economic activity is much less. It dampens the risk. And that's what the state bank can justify. And it can also compete, by the way, with all the private banks. There is no conflict there. As we know, Brazil, most of Europe, France, India, most countries in this world actually have state banks competing directly with private banks. So it's a healthy system. And yet the state banks could have the goals of society in terms of X percent is going to whatever industry or within the New York State, because it's New York State money. Remember, the American banking system started with the idea of local bank, one bank office. And the concept behind that was the one bank office meant deposits are local and loans will be local, no globalization, so to speak. Now, of course, we've gone on the other extreme of globalized money and so on. So that we cannot bring the local one branch banking, but we can say that X percent of portfolio you take in from the budget should be the local area or within the state and that kind of thing, or we can assign broader categories of portfolios. So the portfolio questions, capital requirement questions, interest. Remember, the other thing we used to have is interest ceilings. And now you can charge 50% APR. And if you make a weekly loan or 2 weekly loan, of course, it's thousands of percent you're charging, where the economy is growing 3%. So there's another total disconnect. Money is growing by hundreds of percent, and GDP is growing by 1.6%. In other words, that is supposed to go last quarter. So how do we live in this world of 1,000% increase in money and 1.6% increase in GDP? So the system really needs our work, and the state bank is absolute necessity at this time. So to explore this possibility of setting it up, have experts kind of have model portfolios, suggested portfolios, capitalization of the bank, management, safety, transparency, all of the things. I think that should be studied, and this is the right time to do it.
Thank you.
You can see how I got energized.
Oh, let's have something from someone who hasn't.
Hi, first I want to thank you and ask if you're reaching out to your constituents. I mean, as someone who has been an environmental health advocate for decades, I'm almost embarrassed to admit, but it's only recently, partially with Occupy, and thank goodness for Westpac, that really begin to see how this issue, the banking and money, affects every other issue that the people in this room care about. And with media against us and everything else, I'm not trying to be pessimistic, because I believe everything's grassroots, but I'm wondering how are you getting the word out and how we can more. And I mean, the question was asked once before tonight, but if there's anything people in this room or what else we can do to move this forward, to educate others, and also to help create this momentum.
That's a very good point, and I need to do more. We do circulate our memos to all of our colleagues to let them know that we would like for them to join us in this. I don't know how many sponsors we have at the moment. I'm sorry, I should know that. But we'll continue to do that. We ourselves need to find a Senate sponsor. So if you have any good ideas for me of somebody that you think a senator in the state that would be interested in it.
I spoke to Liz Kruger.
Okay.
She was awesome about it.
Okay. So we have some potentials there. So I'm sure we'll have a Senate sponsor. I was sitting and thinking, so what do we do at the end of this wonderful meeting tonight? I think it is education. I mean, you all educated me, which is great. I think you maybe educated each other, I'm not sure. And maybe you know it all. This is a very complicated issue. There's no easy answer to it. I think if we had people in the audience, if you are a good writer, letter to the editor, just about some concepts to start to get people in the community to think about it, or a little op-ed piece, or something like that, that people start to read. I think that's very helpful. That's, it reminds me that that's the kind of thing I can do too. I would call your elected officials in Albany, but it could be also your local officials. Because if we, I think Scott was talking about the lack of money and having to cut back on our budgets and everything. And when we cut back on our budgets in the state, we also cut back on the budgets of our localities, whether it's the school district, and the property taxes have to go up, or there aren't some services, or some people lose jobs. And for our cities and towns, they lose money too. So if you have any contacts, or whether you do or you don't, it's a good opportunity just to call your elected officials and just say, I went to a meeting the other night, and I learned a lot about this whole prospect of maybe having a public bank in New York State. I think we should explore it. We're not saying we must do it, because I think we heard tonight, you've got to figure out what the parameters are. I believe you have to find out how you're going to structure it so that it is a really valid, excellent public bank, because if you don't, nobody else is going to do it, and it will fall apart. We have to figure out what amounts of money, I was going to ask that question, what we might have to start with, and we have to be willing to do that, to put into the coffers, or maybe it is redesigning some of our pots of dollars that we have already to be, to be the seed for it, and then let it grow. So, I know there are probably some other ideas that you have, organizations that you're with, that you could ask one of these speakers if they'd ever come out from New York City. You're all New York City, aren't you?
Yeah.
No, you're not.
I am.
You are, and you are. Okay, right. But, if you had an organization meeting, you could ask, and Søren Koshek, who's a professor at Pace, lives in Briarcliff in my district, so, he'd be willing to come and talk. So I think that would be a way, too, to kind of spread the word, because it's going to take, you know, change is like C-H-A-N-G-E is really, really hard, particularly in our very, I don't know, our very northeast state of New York. I mean, I just find it's so hard. I work on consolidation issues, changing the form of government. It is slow. It is really slow. We all know we can save money, but it is really slow. So, you know, I think this is just one of those things that has, you know, some change. Do you have some ideas?
Well, on that specific subject, as you had said, this could be of great interest to the local municipalities who are at the tail end of the variability on the state pension fund, and you know, it's something that if it was framed correctly would appeal, I think, to just about every municipal official, and it can, as you say, it's a crossover. It can be appealed to both, you know, people on all sides of the spectrum. So what I would recommend is that right now you have a bill for a study, and it seems that that's a necessary preliminary step. You have to get all the details. You have to make sure that you're proposing a good schema. So if we've crafted a resolution that was declaring support for that bill and passed it around to all the municipal governments around it, told them why they had a stake in this, then I think there'd be a pretty good chance that you would get sign-off on that. And that, I think, in terms of the grassroots build-up, would be a pretty significant impact, because they're talking to their legislators. We could go to David Buchwald and we say, we want you to co-sponsor. I think it's a way to fast-track some impact on this.
Yeah, speaking to that, there is actually an online petition which I started a couple of years ago on change.org to support Sandy Galeff's bill. She's probably sick of getting the emails from that. But if you go on to change.org and you look up public banking, and you'll probably find that for New York, let's say. And it explains the whole thing about the CAFRs and the funding. I mean, obviously in a much briefer version than I did tonight. But it has the links to the bill, and you can go on and sign that. And then also, I've written a number of articles for Huffington Post and Op-Ed News. Op-Ed News, anybody can actually register, and you can write articles.
I think for the municipal officials, it needs to be a certain format. It needs to be, you know, it needs to strike directly at their concerns and be understandable and something they can just sign off on. You know, if you ask them to sort of do some of the work, like just give them a phone call, hey, I was at a meeting the other day, forget it. All the other priorities, we just move ahead and you're not going to get any action. You craft a resolution, you know, we believe this in a nice, real simplistic, anybody can walk off the street and understand it, and then it might go right through. So,
how about a speaker at the Municipal Officials Association meeting?
Sure.
Because that would...
come together with this.
Right, with that at the same time. So we'll try to organize that.
Yeah.
Good.
I'm sorry, two Elizabeth.
Yes, I'll just say a few words. First, thank you to Westpac and all of you. I'm really happy to be here. You know, I come from Orange County, and I wasn't around during the period of time when everybody was running for office, and we had a new congressman elected, and I voted for him too. A Democrat, Sean Patrick Maloney, my new congressman, who, as a Democrat, made very many promises that including not finding a way to not subsidize the oil industries and not to use taxpayer dollars for various things. Well, I think some of you may know that a couple of weeks ago, Sean Patrick Maloney, my congressman in the 19th district, sponsored some rather interesting bills. And he sponsored this bill, or bills, in the Congressional Agriculture Committee rather than in whatever the normal committee is for sponsoring such bills. And the reason for that, as I understand it, is that he and the others who were involved felt that there wouldn't be that much press on it. Well, these bills would limit liability for major banks. When they made their major investments, billions, millions of dollars, and they're taking high risks with money that they then don't want to have to pay the costs if they lose. And the week before this bill was signed that would, in effect, eliminate the Dodd-Frank bill. A week before that, one of the big banks, I forget which one it was at the moment, lost about $11 million. And a week later, these bills are being supported in the Congress. And a lot of people voted for them. And they will have to go before the entire body of the legislature soon. But I'm very unhappy about this. And I just want to say, I would like very much, if possible, to get a hold of the tape on this. Because one of the ways that we could all get it, in fact, it would be very helpful to bring it to various meetings. If we don't have the experts up front, we can bring the experts with us on a DVD. I think that would be great if we could do that.
One of the things that you could do, I hope we can get the tape. Can we get the tape?
Absolutely.
Good.
Rhythm will be providing us with 3 copies, and then we can always do duplications.
Right, great. Because with the tape, if you're, New York City might be a little different, but in our communities, if you go to your cable company and ask to put a tape on, it may be a government channel or it might be a public access channel. You know, you have to figure out how you do that. But there's a system in place for each one of them. So you might be able to get it on as a community member, and you ask them. Yes?
Yeah, hi. I have in my hand something that I picked up on the back chair. It says, in assembly pre-filed. Is this not a proposal for exactly what you were talking about?
Yes, yes, that's my bill. That's
your bill?
Right, that's my bill.
Okay, so this is basically what he was talking about. It would be helpful to have a petition written and sent around and signed regarding this, with this attached?
That's what my petition does.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the bill, and I try to update it every year as it gets reintroduced. But this is the bill that I've been trying to get people to sign up to promote. Okay. Exactly.
And it might be best to do it through you so that it all comes from one place so the numbers grow.
So where do I get a copy of the petition? On change.org?
Yeah, it's on change.org, and unfortunately I don't remember the URL offhand, but if you look for public banking for New York State and change.org will probably give it.
And that can be sent
or you
around?
can email me too and I'll send it to you.
Okay, very good.
Is your
Thank you.
email
Just
on
wanted to see.
Handout, yeah.
The handout.
Quickly just announce, most of you I know in the room, that if you'd like to keep abreast of developments with public banking in New York, make sure you sign in and very eventually write your email address so that we can keep you updated as developments happen.
May I say one more thing? Thank you for volunteering my service. I'll be very happy to work with this group and hopefully the group expands. I also wanted to say that actually it so happens tomorrow morning in the American Banker I have an op-ed piece coming up, basically arguing that the fare in the banking system has been very slow in lending to individuals and small businesses. So that piece is coming out tomorrow, and then that can be expanded to this idea of a state bank and things like that. Here we are 5.5 years after September 2008, and still we are in the 7.7% unemployment of 1.6% growth. So it's a pretty bad situation, and something has to be done. Thank you.
Actually, I think that's probably, unless somebody else has a question, that's probably a good note for us to end on. I just really want to thank you all very, very much for being here. Your attention, your questions, your interests are just great. And you've gotten me all excited about working even harder, and everybody else here. So we do have a lot of work to do. We have to really spread the word about you know, where we think we should go in New York State to protect our tax dollars and protect our programs in the state as well as individuals. So if you have any questions at all, I think all of our numbers might be someplace on a telephone number. I'm in the phone book, 914-941-1111. You can call me and we can get everybody else's number thing here. Westpac has everything. Maybe you want to send out a note to everybody that's here.
You'll get a follow-up email from me.
Great. We want to thank Westpac again for putting together a wonderful panel. Thank you.
Change.org. And the petition, would it be helpful to have a petition written and sent around and signed regarding this? Would this attach?
That's what my petition does.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the bill, and I try to update it every year as it gets reintroduced. But this is the bill that I've been trying to get people to sign up to promote. Okay. Exactly.
And it might be best to do it through you so that it all comes from one place so the numbers grow.
So where do I get a copy of the petition? On change.org?
Yeah, it's on change.org, and unfortunately I don't remember the URL offhand, but if you look for public banking for New York State and change.org, you'll probably get it.
And that can be sent
or you
around?
can email me too, and I'll send it to you.
Okay, very good.
Is your
Thank you.
email
Just
on
wanted to
the
see.
handout, yeah.
The handout.
Quickly just announce, most of you I know in the room, that if you'd like to keep abreast of developments with public banking in New York, make sure you sign in and very mentioned write your email address so that we can keep you updated as developments happen.
May I say one more thing? Thank you for volunteering my service. I'll be very happy to work with this group and hopefully the group expands. I also wanted to say that actually it so happens tomorrow morning in the American Banker I have an op-ed piece coming up, basically arguing that the Fed and the banking system has been very slow in lending to individuals and small businesses. So that piece is coming out tomorrow, and then that can be expanded to this idea of a state bank and things like that. Here we are 5.5 years after September 2008, and still we are in the 7.7% unemployment of 1.6% growth. So it's a pretty bad situation, and something has to be done. Thank you.
Actually, I think that's probably, unless somebody else has a question, that's probably a good note for us to end on. I just really want to thank you all very, very much for being here. Your attention, your questions, your interests are just great. And you've gotten me all excited about working even harder, and everybody else here. So we do have a lot of work to do. We have to really spread the word about you know, where we think we should go in New York State to protect our tax dollars and protect our programs in the state as well as individuals. So if you have any questions at all, I think all of our numbers might be someplace on a telephone number. I'm in the phone book, 914-941-1111. You can call me and we can get everybody else's number thing here. Westpac has everything. Maybe you want to send out a note. Sure.
Said I was in my early 40s with a lot of life before me, when a moment came that stopped me on a dime. I spent most of the next days looking at the x-rays, talking about the options and talking about sweet time. I asked him when it sank in that this might really be the real end. How's it hit you when you get that kind of news? Man, what'd you do? And he said, I went skydiving, I went Rocky Mountain climbing, I went 2.7 seconds on a bull named